Welcome to week 9 of your sports psychology course. This week we're going to be looking at attention, concentration, and focus. So, some of the topics or interventions that we've learned so far, particularly when we're thinking about mindfulness skills, really tap into this area. So, this is going to be a good one to really bring together a few different interventions that we've discussed so far. And we're going to be going over really what is attention, what is concentration, and what is focus, and how do they apply in different sports. So this is definitely an area that can get people caught up and can impact performance if our attention is in the wrong spot. And as I've mentioned in previous lectures, performance is a game of attention. So this week's lecture is a really crucial one because where you direct your attention really matters in terms of what outcomes you're going to get for performance. I would like to acknowledge the people who are the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects to the elders, past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Okay, so for today's lecture, we're going to really be defining attention, concentration, and focus, because they are terms that are used oftentimes interchangeably. But we're just going to highlight what each of those terms mean and how it really relates to sport. Then we're going to look at the types of attentional focus, attentional problems, so what can go wrong with attention, and what can get us caught up. And then finally, some practical application of how do we actually improve concentration in sport to really help us optimize performance. So today's lecture is a bit of theory and then quite a bit of practical application. So hopefully there's a few things that you can really apply from today's lecture, even in your own sport or just in general as a person, as we always need to be using attentional skills to focus on what matters at the right moment. So hopefully this will apply to you, as well as being something that you can use as a practitioner or a teacher. So before we get stuck into the content of today, I want you to actually really reflect for yourself. Because all of us in this lecture, myself included, we use attentional skills every single day for each task that we're engaged in. So if you think about for you in a context where you need to perform, think about how you concentrate when you perform a skill. What do you focus your attention on? Is there a particular skill? Like if you're thinking about sport right now, can you maybe recognize where you focus your attention? And maybe that's changed from when you were a beginner to if now you're a little bit more confident in that sport. For some of you, this next question might be relevant. Are you easily distracted? So as university students, do you find it really hard to direct your attention onto completing assignments? Or do you find that your mind is getting so easily distracted onto other things that you really find it hard to shift back? And for you as well, what factors might limit or prevent you from focusing your attention effectively? So just have a bit of a ponder on maybe which of those questions might be most relevant for you, and maybe use that as a lens as we're going through the content today, and have a think about what maybe practical applications might relate to you in terms of what you can actually take away to maybe help improve something for yourself. Particularly if you're looking at getting easily distracted, I'm hoping that you can maybe jump onto one of the strategies we talk about towards the end of the lecture and actually practice it for yourself and see what effects that has. Because as teachers or practitioners, we really want to be practicing what we preach. So if you're going to be teaching some of the athletes skills to our students or athletes, we want to be confident that it actually works. And the best way of doing that is to actually apply it to yourself and experience what works for you. because you're going to be a lot better at communicating it when you've had that real experience. As I'm going through these definitions, I want you to just keep in mind that I'm going to bring it all together into a slide to compare attention, concentration, and focus and identify how they differ. But recognizing that oftentimes we use these terms quite interchangeably. And they're really talking about this similar domain of where we put our cognitive energy into, in terms of stimuli in the environment. And as I'll go through in a minute, depending on whether we're talking about attention, concentration, or focus, it really is how broad or narrow the attention or the resources go to. So when we're thinking about attention, this is more of the broad definition. So it's really a process around selecting stimuli in our environment and bringing it to the center of our consciousness. So when we're thinking about attention, we're really talking about where our mind orients based on the stimuli that's put in front of us. And attention is very closely linked to what we're interested in and learning. So attention is always going to be influenced by our personal characteristics, because we're going to be oriented to pay attention to the things that are relevant to us and that interest us. And our brain is just going to automatically do that, whether we like it or not. Now let's compare attention, which is broader, to concentration. So concentration is a specific form of attention paid to a particular stimulus while ignoring others. So when you think about attention, it's the broad concept of where we are oriented, where we focus our mind to. And then when we're talking about concentration, this is a specific form. So when we're concentrating on something specific in our environment, so when related to sport, concentration relates to focusing on what matters in the moment, right? So for athletes, they're required to focus on the senses and thoughts related to the task at hand, and they have to be selective about their attention. If you just let your mind wander to wherever, it's less likely to land on something that's going to be helpful for your performance. So concentration in sport, it's really about selectively attending to cues or aspects in your environment that are going to help you with your performance. And as we'll talk a little bit about later in the lecture, across a lot of sports, you don't necessarily land on one target of attention throughout that whole performance. Oftentimes attention or concentration is dynamic. So we're constantly shifting from one set of stimuli to the other. And really, when we're thinking about sport, it's a deliberate mental effort. So what I guess a lot of the content of our sports psychology lectures have really targeted is you actually have to train your brain to concentrate on what is actually relevant and what is actually going to be helpful. Because if you don't take that deliberate mental effort, your attention may wander onto irrelevant or distractions that are actually moving you away from the performance. So when we're thinking about concentration in sport, we're really thinking about that deliberately using your mental efforts to pay attention to an object, idea, or target. And we really have to train ourselves to know what's actually going to be useful and what's actually going to be unhelpful to concentrate on. Serena Williams, in her understanding of concentration, she was quoted to say, "If you can keep playing tennis while someone is shooting a gun down the street, that's concentration." So the ability to be fully concentrating on the task at hand, despite distractions going on in the environment, which I think a gunshot going down the street, that's a pretty strong distractor. But if you're able to still play tennis and concentrate on the task at hand, then that's a sign that you're pretty zoned in on your performance. Now, the final definition is focus. Now, as you've probably heard already, I'm conscious of myself even using those terms interchangeably, because we just use attention, concentration, and focus so interchangeably. But really, when we're talking about focus, it's the most narrow use of attention. So pinpointing one's consciousness single-mindedly on a point of consideration or target spot. So the idea is that when we're using the term focus, it's really the most narrow and full use of our senses and mental powers directed towards a single important thought or action, whereas attention is more broad. Distinguishing between attention, concentration, and focus. So the easiest way to explain this is attention is more broad, as a more broad term for where our consciousness goes in terms of the stimuli. Concentration is more narrow, it's that specific domain, and then focus is the most narrow. So what actual thing within that domain are we focusing on? So just highlighting that concentration and focus, they all serve the same purpose, which is to attend to the stimuli related to basically what we're doing and what matters, whilst ignoring or not attending to stimuli that is not relevant or that's unhelpful in the situation or in terms of the purpose we're trying to get to. So when we're thinking about differentiating them, the easiest way to think about it is to just visualize this continuum. Attention is the most broad and focus is the most narrow. And you'll often see in the literature that these terms are used quite interchangeably anyways, but just to give you that full understanding, this is how we can differentiate between the three components. So I'm going to start with the types of attentional focus. And I imagine that many of you may have seen this image or heard of these terms around external or internal focus and broad versus narrow. So what's really important in sports psychology is the answer to what type of attentional focus we need. It's so dependent on the sport we're talking about, and it's also dependent on even the position you're playing. So when we're thinking about the type of sports, so we're thinking about open skills sports versus closed skills sports. So when we're talking about open skills, we're really thinking about your rugby, your AFL, the ones where there's a lot of different stimuli really that your brain is going to have to attend to. Whereas closed skills sports, this is more narrow. So if we're thinking about professional shooting, where you really have to focus on quite a narrow set of attention, whereas when we're thinking about open skill sports like AFL, you need that broad attention. Because if you only focus on one narrow aspect, maybe you're running, you've got the ball in your hand, and you're just going to focus on bouncing the ball. That's going to be unhelpful, because if you have no awareness and you're not attending to who's running after you, that's not going to be super helpful. So whether or not your attention would be beneficial to be more broad or narrow, it's really dependent on the sport. So when we're thinking about broad, we're thinking about more open skill sports. When we're thinking about narrow, we're thinking about more closed skill sports. And within the sport, you may need more of a broad or more of a narrow, depending on the position that you're playing. So a centre in netball, because they have to be aware of where the players are around them, they're going to different sides of the court all the time. Their attention is probably going to be more useful to be more broad than someone else. For example, a goal shooter who only stays in that one position, and for example, when the goal shooter has the ball in their hand and they're focusing on actually taking that shot, they're a lot more likely to be using more narrow attention throughout the game. But of course, they're still going to need to shift between narrow and broad and be dynamic throughout the performance. So this diagram is really just a way of explaining and identifying where does your attention need to be. And depending on the performance you're engaging in, depending on a lot of factors, our brain is really often needing to be quite dynamic in shifting between them. Now, I will just say that broad versus narrow, definitely sport dependent and definitely quite dynamic, and is going to be shifted between that quite a lot. Whereas there's a bit of research that actually suggests that for motor skill performance, that external focus is typically based on the research more helpful than internal. So in general, when we're talking about motor skills, Having that external focus of attention is more useful than focusing too much on internal components. So that's one where it's a little bit more stable in terms of focus of attention. So this slide just really looks at some studies around attention and optimal performance. So when we're really thinking about expert versus novice athletes, there is some very good research that suggests that athletes who have improved attentional control, so that ability to control their attention and focus on helpful targets of attention, they are better performers than those athletes who have poor attentional control. And this has even been shown in eye movement patterns. So they actually have in the research an ability to track where your attention is through where your eyes actually move to and what they're orienting to. And that eye movement patterns are actually able to differentiate between the expert performers and the novice performers. So these studies are really suggesting that where your attention is really going to have a direct impact on your success and that optimal performance. And so, this is really just highlighting the whole point of this lecture is that we need to train this area because it matters. It matters for performance. And this last point, as I just mentioned in the previous slide, external focus is superior based on the research to internal focus for both performance and learning for motor performance. So generally, when we're thinking about what type of attention, external versus internal, during a motor performance, the external is generally going to be more helpful based on the research. Whereas for the broader narrow, as I mentioned, depends on the sport, depends on your position, depends on what you're doing at the time. Now, as you can imagine, attention, if left to its own devices, can sometimes wander onto aspects that are not overly helpful for our performance. So we've really touched on quite a few of these throughout the lectures so far, but just highlighting that there can be kind of internal distractors as well as external distractions. So when we're thinking about internal distractions, we're talking about our thoughts and feelings. So getting caught up on past mistakes, very common to be a distractor when our attention starts to focus on the last time we did that performance and stuffed up. Or maybe getting caught up in future events. So one of the biggest ones is getting really caught up on the outcome, which takes you away from actually attending to the task at hand. Over-analyzing body mechanics. So as we talked about in the lecture around choking, when we are under pressure, if our attention starts to break down, like body mechanics, such as like riding a bike, if you really think about how you're trying to pedal, that can disrupt that automaticity and that attention. So rather than being on breaking down the task, it's better off being more external, focusing on another aspect of that performance. As well as fatigue. So that's an emotion. And really, when we're thinking about internal distractions, we can talk about any emotion. So if we're really caught up in that, whether we're feeling anxious, whether we're feeling fatigued, and if we're bringing our attention to that and getting caught up in that, that's bringing our attention away from the task at hand and what we actually need to do. So focusing on our anxiety or focusing on your fatigue, that's not actually going to help you perform better. It's a lot more likely to actually negatively impact your performance. And similarly with external distractions. So when we're thinking about sport, especially at the elite level, the visual distractions, so you've got the audience, the scoreboard, maybe television crew, maybe you see mum in the crowd or you see an opponent that you get caught up on. Anything visual can really take your attention away from maybe what's actually more helpful in that moment. There's also sounds, so that crowd noise, mobile phones, the coach yelling. Some of those things can really get your attention, and your attention might be oriented to some of those things, and that's going to move you away from where your attention might need to be in that moment. And then gamesmanship. So sledging, stalling, time wasting. In tennis, that's a big one where some of the tricky tennis players can, if they notice that the momentum of the game is not in their favour, they might really slow down between serves. And the person on the other end can get really caught up in that. It might bring their attention onto how slow that person's going, rather than actually sticking to being ready for when the serve is hit, so that they can be prepared to actually hit back. So internal and external distractions, they're going to interrelate to each other. So for example, gamesmanship, like if someone's sledging you, it's highly likely that that could then lead to an emotional response and maybe get really angry that that person said that to you. And then you get really caught up in the anger, and then that moves you away from the fact that you're actually playing a sport and you're actually needing to perform. So I want to really highlight that when we're talking about attention, this stuff is not easy. The ability to pay attention to what matters when there are so many distractions going on, and particularly when you have strong emotions come up, that's really, really difficult. And it can take a lot of training and a lot of practice to do, even just in general life, really. But to do it on stage, in front of a lot of people, when you've got so many distractions going on, it's really difficult. And this is why a lot of the sports psychology interventions are designed to really help bring attention back onto what matters. So this is just really important to be aware of, because you can actually, as we'll talk about later, you can actually practice in putting some of these distractions and practice bringing your attention back onto what matters. As we've discussed choking in a previous lecture, I thought it would be helpful to just tie that into how choking kind of relates to that attentional domain. Because as you would probably recall, one of the theories around choking is that it actually leads attention to be directed into unhelpful areas. So if we think about this diagram when choking occurs, some of the conditions that are more likely to lead to choking is that the importance of the competition. So maybe that perceived pressure increases, and that's also relevant for the critical plays, a critical moment in a competition. The pressure is higher, so that the stakes are higher, and so it's a lot more likely to lead to choking, because the ability to be distracted onto something else in that moment is really high. And even just that perception of evaluation by coaches, peers, or parents, really what this is talking about is that these are factors that increase the pressure and increase the likelihood that attention is going to wander onto some of those aspects. And when that pressure is increased during choking, what actually can happen is that because of, if we think about that fight or flight response we've talked about in previous lectures, our brain automatically is going to shift to threats. And what we typically do when there's a threat is we really focus our attention narrowly to identify that threat. So we bring our attention there and we can become a lot more rigid and really focused on that threat. When actually it's more helpful for our attention to be, for example, as I mentioned for motor skills, it's actually a lot more helpful for our attention to be external at that point. And the idea that it's internal and narrow, that automatically happens. And we have to have those skills to actually bring our attention back to the external aspects and notice when we're going to that threat. The next one is performance. And so the way that choking then impairs our performance is that because of our attention maybe shifted onto those internal focus and that narrow focus, we can get really caught up in the inability to attend to the task relevant cues. So our focus is shifted to that threat rather than being focused on what's actually important, what cues are important to actually execute the skill. And as a consequence, our body can really react accordingly. So when we're really focused on the threat, our timing and coordination can break down, our muscles can tighten, and we might rush because we panic in the situation. And then as you can see, that next one is the physical changes. So physical changes can happen to our body related to that fight or flight response. So a lot of these things that happen in choking, they can happen quite automatically. But we can override them if we're aware, and we can actually direct our attention onto a more external focus if we're aware and if we're practiced in it, if we've done the work behind the scenes. So that's a big caveat to this, is that because our brains are trying to protect us, these things are automatically going to happen. And it actually does take a lot of work, and it's difficult to actually bring our attention elsewhere when there's a perceived or real threat. But we can do it. But we really have to practice doing this. It's not something that's going to come naturally. It has to be learnt and practiced well. So the next half of this lecture is really going to be focused on the how we can actually do this to really improve our ability to concentrate and pay attention when it matters. So this is just a little bit of an orienting slide. So I'm going to be going into detail about each of these aspects. And it's really important, as you'll see throughout the different points there, it's really about practice. It's really about having a plan, and it's really about the last comment, over learning skills. So when we're talking about directing our attention, when it matters, under pressure in performance, we have to have done the work beforehand. Now, this is an area that a lot of athletes maybe struggle to comprehend the importance of, and what you'll often find is it's very evident which athletes have done the work in preparing and practicing where they're going to bring their attention, and those who haven't done the work. And as I've mentioned in an earlier slide, there is research that actually tracks this and proves that point, that the novice athletes, compared to the expert athletes, you can really see a difference in where they put their attention when it matters. So what we're thinking about when looking at improving concentration is really awareness. So that first point there, talking about focusing on controllables versus things that are out of your control. So as human beings, we can often get quite caught up in the things that are out of our control. We can spend a lot of our energy and attention onto aspects that are out of our control. And a perfect example of this is our emotions. We can dedicate a lot of time and energy into trying to control emotions when that's not fully in our control. And so our energy oftentimes in sport is a lot better off focusing on, for example, our physical body, because we have a lot more control over how we actually utilize our physical body. So it's really about becoming aware and noticing what's in your control and what's out of your control, and then investing your energy wisely. So you've got a certain energy investment. Let's invest as much energy into things that we have as much control over as possible. And the things we don't have control over, sure, we can notice and acknowledge them, but we're not going to spend too much of our energy investment there. So a good practical strategy for being able to do this is literally in our preparation phase, when we're preparing for a competition, actually write a list of what factors in your sport is in your control, and then write a list of factors in your sport that are not in your control. And even just having that conversation, having that list written down, could actually impact how quickly an athlete is able to shift in their sport when they know this and they have awareness that they're actually caught up in something that's out of their control. And this is where the next point is really going to tie into. So you can actually practice spending your energy onto what matters, and actually practice letting go of or accepting and making room for things that are out of your control, but not investing your energy there. So this next point, simulation training, such a powerful tool. We have to practice the ability to replicate game situations and really replicate distractions. and replicate where we need to shift our attention during the performance. So if we can replicate and try and build pressure in as many ways as possible in a training environment. However, as you'll see the note mentioned at the bottom there, that's not generally enough. If we're really trying to improve concentration as a sports psychologist, it's going to be important to be there to actually properly debrief with the athlete, to actually identify and reflect on the times when the athlete maybe did focus their energy on something that wasn't helpful, and actually help them identify and reflect on that and link it to where that actually negatively impacted their performance, whilst also being able to debrief and reflect on where their attention was focused on a helpful cue, and reflect on how that actually improved their performance and really assist them in making that connection. So a really good example of this is a race simulation. So if we think about sprinting, for example, in athletics, a sports psychologist would be looking at how can you put the athlete into a simulated environment. Maybe they would bring a bit of a crowd, make some noise so that there's some distractions involved, and get the athlete to actually simulate that race day as much as possible. What would it be really like to race on that track, and really make a conscious effort to be really clear with the athlete and then reflect on where their attention needs to be in order to optimize that performance. As I said in an earlier slide, in sport, we need to be in charge of where we're directing our attention. So if we just let our attention go to wherever it wants, it's highly likely that it's going to go somewhere unhelpful. So really making it clear and letting the athlete have a solid understanding of where their attention needs to be during that performance. Now, similar to the simulation training, we can kind of adapt this slightly to just be even more focused on practicing with distractions. So if you're in a sport and you can identify common distractors, then a sports psychologist can actually try to introduce those at training and get the athlete to practice shifting back to relevant cues during a performance. So this is very similar to the simulation training, but it's just having the focus on really identifying distractions and really helping the athlete get used to those distractions being there and bringing their attention back onto what matters. With this, oftentimes the best person to ask and to develop the intervention with, or for themselves, is the athlete, because they know exactly what's going to be a useful or realistic distractor to practice with, and what distractions aren't even really going to bother them at all. So when designing an intervention, it's going to be really useful to get that feedback from the athlete to really identify common distractions that are specific to them. An example could be saying the time. So for a particular athlete, during a performance, that could be a really big distraction. And so you could get them to really notice that and then shift their attention back as soon as possible. Other distractors might be actually removing or providing a constraint. So an example in swimming could be removing the lane ropes, because the athlete is probably really used to having certain stimuli there. So you can provide a really big distraction that's so different to what they're used to actually get the athlete to still come back onto what their cues are and what they need to focus on. The next point is connection to cues. So when we're thinking about really improving concentration during a performance, the cue word aspect is very important. It is common that when designing a simulation training or a distraction drill, that a connection to cues is incorporated. So if a sports psychologist or coach is going to provide a distraction or simulate a training environment, they have to support the athlete in knowing where their attention needs to be and what's going to be helpful for them to direct their attention to. So we've talked about cue words in previous lectures, so I haven't really defined this or added too much else here because it is in previous lectures. But really what we're talking about is utilizing the cue that works for the athlete under pressure. And as I've also mentioned in previous lectures, it's really going to depend on the type of sport, the individual factors of the athlete, and what they practice and what works for them. The other aspect you would want to keep in mind when it comes to cue words is really thinking about what type of attention do we want to get the athlete to focus on? And how would that cue word actually help them direct it to more of an external or more of a broad, if you know that's what will assist with their performance? However, it always comes back to the individual and working on cues that are going to help them and relate to them so that they can shift their attention to where it's needed most. This next one is imagery or mental rehearsal. So hopefully the term imagery makes sense for you because we've done a whole lecture on it. But the main idea mentioned here in regards to improving concentration is incorporating the helpful targets of attention into imagery scripts to help that individual with practicing where to shift their attention during a performance. Even just general mental rehearsal. So getting the athlete to think, okay, what am I actually going to be doing in my performance? Where should my focus be? What are my cues? Going over that in your mind before a performance can be super, super helpful, because if you don't do that and you don't know where it's going to be helpful for your attention to be, it's a lot more likely and it's going to be a lot easier for your mind to just wander onto any type of threat or any other type of distraction. The less planning and practice you've done, the more likely your mind is just going to wander onto unhelpful cues, and it's going to be harder and harder to bring it back. Another really helpful strategy to improve concentration for optimal performance is the pre-performance routines. So this really frees up our attentional resources by having a structured routine. So rather than having to be really conscious of, okay, well, where does my attention need to be? The athlete has practiced this over and over again. They have a routine. They know when to shift their attention onto what tasks, onto what area, whether that be broad, narrow, external, internal. They know when to do that because it's all a part of their routine, and they don't have to use a lot of energy to actually do that because they've already created that neural pathway in their mind and they've practiced it. So just an example, when we're thinking about a pre-performance routine for a golfer, let's start with number 1. So assessing the situation. So this requires more of an external, broad form of attention where, you have to have that awareness of where you are on the golf course. Distance when taking in broad array of factors. Then in your pre-performance routine, you analyze. So you select the club and you visualize the shot you plan to make. So this is more of a broad internal. Then we go to prepare. So as a part of their routine, they do a centering breath, they have a particular cue words, and they develop a feel for the shot. So that's where the attention is more narrow and internal. And then particularly for golf, an external, narrow form of attention is what's going to be most useful. So during the act, they focus on the target, the ball, and they execute the swing. So they end on external narrow, but by noticing within the pre-performance routine, they've gone through the different types of attention and they don't have to consciously think about that too much because it's a routine now and they've developed that neural pathway in their brain and it's a lot more likely to just happen. So if a really big distractor came up, they'd be a lot more equipped to bring their attention back onto their routine instead of maybe someone who has no routine at all. They might find themselves getting quite fixated on their distraction and not really know how to bring their attention back onto what matters. Now, of course, we're going to touch on mindfulness. And as you can imagine, this is quite an important component of improving concentration. Because when we're thinking about mindfulness skills, we're thinking about training our brain. And there is actually research, which I'm going to show you in a little second with a video, around the fact that mindfulness skills can actually improve attentional control, which is actually evident in brain scans. So it's not just us talking about it, it's actually neuroscientifically evident that when you actually engage in a mindfulness skill and you practice this, your ability with attentional control improves. And this relates to your ability to notice distractions and bring your attention, so control that attention, onto what matters and what's important. And so it's really important to highlight that even if the athlete knows, for example, what cue they want to focus on, if they don't do the work behind the scenes to actually practice their ability to notice the distraction and bring their mind back, if they haven't practiced that, they might find it hard to actually shift away from that distraction. Even if they do know what would be more helpful, they may actually find that hard to do. So this is where mindfulness skills can really form that middle point between noticing the distraction and actually being able to bring your awareness back to the helpful cue that you've developed. Now, on the Hexaflex, the skills that are most relevant here for attention are acceptance. So when we're thinking about acceptance, what we're really talking about is making room or making space for distractions with the thoughts or feelings. So making room for them to be there and really not getting caught up in them. We're accepting that they're there. We're not trying to fight them. We're not caught up in the struggle. We're going to shift our energy back onto what matters. And this is similar with diffusion. So rather than getting fused or caught up with an internal distraction, like a difficult thought or feeling, we're creating distance from that. We're recognizing the thought is just a thought. A feeling is just a feeling. It doesn't represent an ultimate truth or an ultimate command. It doesn't need to control our behavior. We create distance through diffusion skills, and it allows us to bring our attention onto what matters. And then present moment awareness. I think that probably is quite self-explanatory, that in order to execute skills, we need to be in the moment. We need to be focusing on what's happening right now, rather than worrying about the past or what's going to be happening in the future. So when it comes to performance, being in the present, being mindful, being aware, that is the main component that is going to benefit your performance. Now, in addition to these mindfulness skills, the use of mindfulness meditation can be super helpful. And there's research that suggests that 12 minutes most days of the week is enough to strengthen areas of the brain involved in attentional control. And this is going to be evident in a video that I'm about to show you. But there's also an excellent resource. It's a book by Dr. Amishi Jha that's called Peak Mind. And it incorporates a range of evidence-based meditations to support training attention. And this book actually references particular groups of people, including athletes, as well as military personnel, where there's a lot of potential for distractions, a lot of high-pressure situations that these individuals may face. And the book goes into specific meditations that can be used to really strengthen those components of the brain. So this book, Peak Mind, is a really useful one to actually help athletes to train this mindfulness meditation skills, which is such a powerful tool and a useful tool to have. So I'm now going to show you a video that actually explains how mindfulness meditation changes the brain in regards to attention.
Researchers have known for decades that meditation can improve someone's physical and mental health. It can relieve stress, lower blood pressure, and lift someone's mood. But only in the last 10 years have neuroscientists taken a serious look at the changes in brain structure underlying some of meditation's benefits. Like everything else we do, meditation rewires our neural circuits, pruning away the least used connections and strengthening the ones we exercise most. Studies looking for signs of these changes usually focus on mindfulness meditation, which challenges people to keep their attention fixed on their thoughts and sensations in the present moment. Scientists acknowledge that many of these studies are small and not ideally designed, but at this point, researchers have gathered enough evidence to be confident that their findings are not just flukes. Experiments suggest that Buddhist monks have really robust connections between scattered regions of their brains, which allows for more synchronized communication. Expert meditators also seem to develop an especially wrinkly cortex, the brain's outer layer. We depend on the cortex for many of our most sophisticated mental abilities, like abstract thought and introspection. Several studies have confirmed that meditation can increase the volume and density of the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped area of the brain in the middle of the skull that is absolutely crucial for memory. And although areas of the brain responsible for sustaining attention usually shrink as we age, meditation counteracts this decay. An increasing number of studies show that meditating for as little as 12 to 20 minutes a day for several weeks can sharpen the mind. In these studies, meditators have scored higher on tests of attention and working memory, which is the ability to temporarily store and manipulate information in one's mind. Some lifelong meditators in their 50s and 60s can even outperform 20-somethings on tests of visual attention. So if you're interested in trying meditation, you should probably start as soon as possible. For Scientific American's Instant Egghead, I'm Ferris Jaber.
So as you can see with that video, the benefits of mindfulness skills on actually changing the brain are so clear within the scientific community. And there are brain imaging studies that literally show the changes in the brain. So if we're going to be looking at supporting athletes in improving the area of attention, concentration, and focus, having a component of mindfulness to support them in being more in control of where their attention is so powerful. And it's the reason why I've probably annoyed you with how much I bring it up, but this is such a core component of the work of sports psychologists and in really supporting optimal performance. So hopefully that maybe was a bit of an eye-opener for you as well and for your personal life. And if we bring that back to the initial self-reflection question I highlighted at the start of the lecture, maybe that's a component that you might start to do for yourself in your own life. If you found that you're very easily distracted and you find it really hard to actually bring your attention back onto the task at hand, maybe you could play around with utilizing some mindfulness meditations to actually hone that skill for yourself and improve your ability to pay attention, maybe when it comes to study, for example. And so, I can't highlight enough how useful that is. And we are so lucky nowadays to have access to many incredible resources, such as really any kind of app as well, like the Headspace app or Insight Timer. There are some that come to mind with a really easily accessible mindfulness meditations that you can utilize. As well also as that book, Peak Mindset. It actually highlights a lot of evidence-based mindfulness scripts that you can use as well. So I just want to encourage that, particularly for all of us to practice what we preach, because if you do want to become a sports psychologist specifically, this is such a big component of that role. And it's powerful if you have experience of your own, because it's going to come across a lot more authentic when you encourage your athletes to try it for themselves as well. Whereas if you've never tried it and you're like, this is so powerful, this has such an impact, it's going to come across if you've never given it a go. So just wanted to thank you all for your attention during today's lecture, and hopefully you got something useful out of today.